The whip cracked through the air like thunder on a storm-torn plain. In the dusty heart of a Colorado town, a young woman in a torn wedding dress was dragged to a wooden post, punished for refusing the richest rancher in the territory. The crowd stood frozen, fear chaining their silence as the lash rose high to strike. But before it could fall, a stranger stepped forward. His broad shoulders blocked the blow, his hand catching the leather across his own flesh. Beside him, a German shepherd bristled and barked, defying the mob. And with a voice as steady as steel, the man declared, "She's already taken." That moment lit the spark of a story that would change everything. A tale of defiance, of love forged in fire, and of a family built from the ashes of cruelty. Welcome to today's story. What begins with a single act of courage will carry us through gunfire, false vows that become real promises, and a fight for freedom in the untamed West. Stay with me until the end. You won't want to miss how a lash meant to break a woman instead gave her a home, a husband, and a future she never dreamed possible. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And if you believe that courage and loyalty can change fate itself, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Whip in the Square. The spring afternoon in prosperity, Colorado carried the weight of a storm pressing down on the dusty little frontier town. The sky above was swollen with low, bruised clouds, the kind that promised thunder, but held back just long enough to let the heat cling to the earth. A restless wind swept through the main street, stirring grit into the eyes of shopkeepers and passers-by. The air reeked of sweat, horse dung, and the tension of a community about to witness something it would rather not. Prosperity was no place of glory. It was a settlement born of greed and survival, its wooden storefronts warped by weather, its boardwalks creaking under boots that had seen too many hard miles. The storm in the sky mirrored the storm brewing among its people. For today, punishment was about to be carried out in the open square. Emma Brooks stumbled forward, her wrists bound with coarse rope that bit into her skin. At 21, she should have looked like a bride on the cusp of new beginnings, but her once white wedding dress was torn and dirt-streaked, dragging through the dust as she was forced toward the tall post planted in the center of the square. She was slender, with long auburn hair now matted against her pale cheeks, and her wide green eyes carried the hollow look of someone cornered with no way out. Her parents had been poor tenant farmers, worn down by droughts and debts, and in their desperation, they had sold her future to the wealthiest landowner in the region. William Montgomery was more than twice her age, a man with vast herds of cattle, sprawling lands, and a reputation for buying what he wanted when it suited him, including people. Emma had refused him at the altar, fleeing into the scrub hills before anyone could force the vows from her lips. She had been caught and dragged back, and now she was being made into a spectacle, her shame and defiance on display for everyone to see. The crowd that gathered murmured uneasily, a collection of townsfolk who did not dare interfere. They were men in sweat-stained hats, women clutching shawls close against the wind, children pulled behind skirts so their eyes could be shielded from cruelty. No one stepped forward. It was easier to look away than to challenge the man at the center of power in this region. William Montgomery stood with his shoulders squared, his broad frame wrapped in a dark frock coat despite the heat. He was 52, heavy-set, but still carrying the presence of a man used to command. His gray-streaked beard was trimmed neatly, though his face bore the deep creases of years spent under a relentless sun and a relentless ambition. His eyes were flint, cold and calculating, and his thin lips twisted into a sneer that revealed nothing of mercy. Once, long ago, he had lost a wife to fever, and some whispered that grief had hardened him into the man who now sought control through contracts and fear. But most believed he had never possessed tenderness to begin with. Montgomery had built his empire on intimidation, and he was determined to remind everyone watching what happened to those who denied him. Beside him stood his foreman, Clyde Henson, a wiry man of 40 with sun-leathered skin and a scar dragging down the side of his cheek, like a permanent reminder of old violence. Clyde's eyes were dull, unreadable beneath the brim of his hat, and he carried the whip with the detachment of one accustomed to obeying orders rather than questioning them. He was not cruel for pleasure, but cruelty had long ago become his profession. He uncoiled the whip with practiced ease, the braided leather curling and snapping against the dry air as if eager to taste flesh. Emma's heart pounded. The rope was tied around the post, biting her wrists, and she pressed her face against the rough wood to steady herself. The murmurs of the crowd pressed in on her ears. She shut her eyes, bracing for pain that she knew would come, each lash a punishment for her defiance, each mark a brand of ownership. The whip cracked, but the pain did not follow. Gasps rippled through the gathering like wind through tall grass. Emma opened her eyes, startled, and saw a man standing between her and the blow. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a worn denim shirt now torn across the shoulder where the lash had bitten into him instead. His hand was wrapped around the whip's end, holding it fast with the iron grip of someone who knew how to master pain and turn it back. The stranger's face was lean and angular, his jaw covered in dark stubble that hinted at days spent riding without comfort. His eyes, a piercing shade of blue, carried the chill of winter rivers, clear, steady, and unyielding. A thin scar ran along his chin, as though some earlier fight had tried and failed to break him. He looked to be in his early 30s, the prime of a man shaped by work, war, and wilderness. His name, as the crowd would soon whisper, was Jack Collins. Jack had been a soldier once, men said, and though he never confirmed or denied it, his posture bore the mark of discipline etched in old battles. Rumor suggested he had lost comrades in a border skirmish years earlier, and since then he had kept mostly to himself, running a small ranch north of town. Life had taught him the weight of silence, but also when silence was cowardice. And now, facing Montgomery's wrath, Jack made his choice without hesitation. "She's already taken," he said, his voice low but carrying across the hush. Each word was like a hammer striking iron, forging defiance into something unbreakable. Beside him stood a German shepherd, its hackles raised, lips peeled back in a growl that vibrated deep in its chest. The dog was Max, 4 years old, with a coat of sable black and tan that gleamed even in the fading light. His ears stood erect, his amber eyes fixed on Clyde with the fierce intelligence of a creature born to protect. Muscular yet agile, Max shifted his stance in front of Emma, ready to spring at anyone who dared approach. He had been Jack's companion since puphood, rescued from a litter abandoned on the outskirts of another town. Max was more than a pet. He was loyalty and instinct made flesh, a guardian forged by trust and shared hardship. Montgomery's face darkened with fury, the veins at his temple pulsing. "Who the hell are you to interfere?" he demanded, his voice booming with outrage. The crowd held its breath. Jack's grip tightened on the whip as he stared back at the man who believed he could buy anything, even a woman's soul. "The man who's claiming what's his," Jack replied. "Miss Brooks and I have an understanding. You've been misled if you think she's yours to take." It was a lie, bold and reckless, but it was spoken with such conviction that even Emma, trembling behind him, almost believed it herself. Montgomery's foreman hesitated, the whip limp in his hands. There was something in Jack's stance, a willingness to bleed, a promise of violence, that made him reconsider. For a moment, the square held only silence, broken only by the rumble of thunder rolling over the distant mountains. Then Jack moved. With careful, deliberate hands, he untied the ropes binding Emma's wrists. She stared at him in disbelief, her arms raw and trembling from the bonds, but she did not resist as he lifted her down. "Let's go," he said, loud enough for all to hear. But then he bent low, whispering against her ear, "Play along if you want to live." She nodded, heart hammering, for whatever fate awaited her with this stranger had to be better than Montgomery's lash. Montgomery barked curses, but even his hired men shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to press against the storm gathering in Jack's gaze. Jack swung Emma onto the back of a waiting chestnut mare, mounted behind her with an ease born of years in the saddle. And with a sharp whistle, Max leapt forward, leading the way. The crowd parted silently, their eyes wide as dust and fear mingled in the air. And then, with hooves pounding against the hard-packed street, Jack Collins, Emma Brooks, and the German shepherd named Max galloped out of Prosperity, the thunder at their backs and the whispers of a town forever changed rising in their wake. Chapter 2. Shelter at Collins Ranch. The rain began not long after they left Prosperity, a thin drizzle that streaked across the dusty trail and dampened the air with the smell of wet earth and juniper. The mountains loomed closer now, their dark ridges etched against the sky where lightning forked in the distance. Jack Collins guided the chestnut mare up a narrow track leading into a hidden valley, his posture unshaken despite the wound on his shoulder. Emma Brooks clung tightly to the saddle, her fingers numb from the cold, her green eyes darting to the looming pines and the restless shadows between them. She was exhausted, still trembling from what she had endured, but the stranger's solid presence and the German shepherd racing alongside them lent her a strange comfort she could not yet name. They reached the valley by twilight. The Collins Ranch was no grand estate but a sturdy homestead built by hard hands, a log cabin with a stone chimney puffing faint smoke, a weather-beaten barn with its doors slightly ajar, and a corral where 2 bay horses shifted uneasily in the rain. Fields of early wheat stretched beyond, pale green against the darkened slopes. It was not wealth that marked this place, but persistence, an outpost of survival carved into wilderness. At the barn's entrance stood a young man, no older than 20, wiry and quick-eyed. His name was Daniel Cooper. He had sandy hair that fell across his brow, freckles scattered across his sunburned skin, and a lean frame hardened by ranch work. Daniel had been an orphan since a fever swept through his family when he was 16. Jack had taken him on, offering shelter in exchange for labor, and the boy had grown into a capable hand, loyal almost to a fault. Despite his youth, he carried the wary gaze of someone who had seen loss too soon, yet beneath it there lingered a spark of humor and warmth. Daniel's eyes widened as he caught sight of Emma slumped in the saddle, her wedding dress torn, hair tangled by wind and rain. "Boss!" he called, disbelief edging his voice. "What in God's name?" He stopped himself, catching the warning in Jack's expression. Jack dismounted fluidly, wincing as his injured shoulder protested, then helped Emma down with surprising gentleness. Max circled them, wet fur bristling, letting out a low growl each time thunder cracked overhead. "This is Miss Brooks," Jack said simply, his tone brooking no argument. "She'll be staying with us." Daniel's brows drew together, confusion flickering across his youthful face, but he held his tongue. He respected Jack too much to pry openly, though curiosity burned in his sharp blue eyes. He reached to take the mare's reins and led the animal toward the barn. Emma watched him go, wondering who he was, what place she had been brought into, and whether she could truly be safe here. Inside the cabin, the warmth of a fire met her, the glow of lamplight falling across simple but well-kept furnishings. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with a modest collection of books, and the smell of stew long cooled clinging to the air. Jack gestured her toward the hearth, and she sank into a chair, too weary to resist. Max positioned himself squarely before the door, his amber eyes vigilant, growling softly at every shift of the wind outside. Jack cleaned his wound with water from a basin, biting back a grunt as he poured it over the raw stripe across his shoulder. Emma, watching with wide eyes, whispered, "Why did you do that, for me? You don't even know me." Jack looked at her then, his jaw hard, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Because someone had to," he said. "Men like Montgomery count on silence. I won't give it to him." Before Emma could reply, heavy hoofbeats sounded outside. Daniel rushed in, his face pale. "Riders," he hissed. "Sheriff's colors." A knock came at the door, firm but not hostile. Jack moved to open it, Max bristling at his side. Standing on the porch was Sheriff James Taylor, a man in his late 40s with graying hair beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He was tall, with broad shoulders that had begun to soften with age, but his bearing remained authoritative. A thick mustache covered his upper lip, and his brown eyes, though kind, carried the weary weight of years spent balancing law against the sway of powerful men. Taylor was known as a fair but cautious lawman, one who had lost a brother to violence years ago and had since chosen diplomacy whenever possible, though his revolver still hung steady at his hip. "Evening, Jack," the sheriff said, his voice level, though rain dripped from the brim of his hat. "I hear tell William Montgomery is crying foul down in Prosperity, claims you stole a bride from his hand." His gaze shifted past Jack to where Emma sat by the fire, pale and trembling. Emma rose on unsteady legs, her voice shaking but firm. "No, I wasn't stolen. I chose to leave. He wanted to own me. I refused." She lifted her chin, though fear still colored her eyes. The sheriff studied her for a long moment, weighing truth against danger. Finally, he sighed, brushing water from his mustache. "Miss, your words carry weight, but Montgomery won't let this lie. He's a man used to winning, and he'll come looking." His eyes shifted back to Jack. "I can't fight your battles for you, not here, but I'll not drag her back either." Jack inclined his head slightly, a rare acknowledgement of gratitude. The sheriff adjusted his coat. "Keep watch. The storm's not just in the sky tonight." With that, he mounted his horse and rode back into the rain, his deputies trailing behind. When the sound of hooves faded, silence fell heavy in the cabin. Emma sat again, her hands twisting in her lap. "He'll come," she whispered. "Montgomery will come for me." Jack crouched beside Max, running a rough hand through the dog's wet fur. "Then let him," Jack murmured. "We'll be ready." Max's ears pricked, as if understanding, his low growl rising once more into the storm-filled night. Chapter 3. The false engagement becomes a real wedding. The rain had passed by morning, leaving the valley damp and glistening, a thin mist rising from the wheat fields around Collins Ranch. The air carried the smell of pine and wet soil, clean and sharp, and birdsong returned hesitantly, as if the world was unsure whether it was safe to be gentle again. Emma Brooks awoke to the sound of a rooster crowing and the low creak of the barn door. She had slept little, turning over what the sheriff had said the night before. Montgomery would not rest. She knew it in her bones. And yet here she was, sheltered in a cabin she had never known, watched over by a man who had stepped between her and the whip, and by the German shepherd that refused to leave her side. Later that morning, as Emma fetched water from the well with Daniel Cooper's help, a figure appeared on the ridge path. Margaret Walker, one of the ranch's nearest neighbors, rode up on a bay mare. She was a stout woman in her early 50s, with rosy cheeks, a streak of iron gray in her dark hair, and a motherly air that made her welcome wherever she went. Her husband, Thomas Walker, owned the next ranch over, and together they had raised 5 children, most of whom were now scattered across Colorado and Kansas. Margaret had a habit of caring too much about the affairs of others, not from malice but from an instinct to knit community together through stories and shared gossip. "Jack Collins," she called cheerfully, sliding off her horse with surprising agility for her age. Her sharp brown eyes darted to Emma, who stood awkwardly clutching the bucket, the tatters of her ruined dress still betraying what she had been through. Margaret's brows lifted, and then her lips curved into a knowing smile. "Well now, no one told me you'd gone and found yourself a bride." Emma flushed crimson, words frozen in her throat. Daniel nearly dropped the pail, his eyes flicking between them with a mix of mischief and disbelief. Jack, who had stepped out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag, frowned deeply, but before he could correct her, Margaret clapped her hands together. "About time, too. A man can't live on bread and horseflesh alone. Every good ranch needs a woman's hand. I'll be telling Thomas we must prepare something proper for the 2 of you." And so it began. By the week's end, word had spread through the valley that Jack Collins and Emma Brooks were engaged. Emma, mortified, tried to insist otherwise, but Margaret's cheerful certainty and Daniel's inability to keep from grinning whenever he saw them together only deepened the impression. Neighbors began dropping by with congratulations, small loaves of bread, jars of preserves, even bolts of fabric for the wedding dress. Emma felt the ground sliding out from beneath her, swept into a tide she had no power to stop. Then, one Sunday morning, Reverend Amos Whitfield rode into the valley. He was a circuit preacher, thin and lanky, with a long face lined from years on horseback and a voice that carried like a bell across a congregation. His hair was thinning, his spectacles always slipping down his nose, but his eyes were keen and searching, accustomed to reading both scripture and souls. He had known Jack since the younger man had settled his ranch, and he greeted him warmly. When Margaret insisted on hosting a gathering in the Walkers' barn that afternoon, Reverend Whitfield agreed to lead a service. By mid-afternoon, families from every ranch for miles around crowded into the barn. The place was alive with the smell of hay and the hum of chatter, lanterns strung high along the beams. Emma stood stiffly at Jack's side, her heart pounding as she felt dozens of eyes upon them. Margaret, beaming like a proud aunt, stood and clapped for silence. "Friends and neighbors," she declared, "today we not only hear the good word, but we celebrate the joining of 2 fine souls. Jack Collins and Miss Emma Brooks have found each other, and what God brings together, no man shall part." Emma nearly choked. She glanced at Jack, whose jaw had tightened, the muscle ticking in his cheek. Yet he did not contradict Margaret. The Reverend looked from one to the other, his brow furrowing, then softening into a smile. "Well then," he said gently, "shall we make it so?" A hush fell over the crowd, expectant, warm, pressing them forward. Emma's throat was dry. She wanted to protest, to explain, but then she saw the faces, Margaret's hopeful glow, Daniel's eager grin, the neighbors smiling, children peeking from behind skirts. For the first time in months, she saw no judgment, no cruelty, only kindness. And then Jack reached for her hand. His palm was rough, scarred, steady. His blue eyes, unflinching, met hers. "If you agree," he murmured, just for her ears, "we can stop pretending." His voice was low, solemn, more a vow than a question. Emma's breath caught. Her heart leapt in her chest, and though fear still twisted inside her, another feeling rose too, trust, fragile and new. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. The Reverend began the words of marriage. Emma felt herself trembling, but when Jack slid a ring onto her finger, a simple silver band, once his mother's, her tears blurred the barn lights. "With this ring, I pledge my word," Jack said. His voice carried, deep and resolute, echoing against the wooden beams. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the barn erupted in cheers. Laughter, clapping, shouts of blessing filled the air. Max, lying obediently at Jack's feet throughout the ceremony, lifted his head and barked once, sharp and clear, as though sealing the moment himself. Jack leaned down, his lips brushing Emma's cheek in a kiss that was brief yet tender, carrying more truth than all the forced vows Montgomery could ever have wrung from her. For the first time, Emma felt something settle in her chest, not fear, but a fragile sense of belonging. Later, as the neighbors feasted and fiddlers played, Emma sat on a bench in the corner, her new husband beside her, Max's warm body pressed against her boots. She looked down at the dog, who met her gaze with solemn amber eyes. For reasons she could not explain, Emma whispered, "So it's real then?" Max only flicked his ears and laid his head back down, but she could have sworn he understood. And in that moment, with laughter rising around her, Emma Brooks realized that her life had changed again. This time, perhaps, for the better. Chapter 4. The Bounty and the Siege. The news spread faster than wildfire on dry grass. By the end of the week, word had reached every saloon, every outpost, every lonely cabin in the Colorado foothills. William Montgomery was offering $5,000 for the return of Emma Brooks. Alive, delivered to his ranch gates. The sum was more than most ranch hands could dream of in a lifetime, more than enough to tempt desperate men with no loyalty except to silver. Posters were nailed to hitching posts, carried by riders, whispered in smoky corners. $5,000 turned friends into spies and men into wolves. Jack Collins knew it. He saddled his horse one gray dawn and told Emma and Daniel he had to ride to Denver to file the marriage papers officially. The law would mean little to Montgomery's fists, but in front of a judge, a lawful certificate of marriage could not be dismissed. Emma stood in the doorway, pale but steady, watching him fasten the scabbard on his saddle. "What if something happens while you're gone?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. Jack glanced at her, his blue eyes calm but unyielding. "Then Daniel will stand guard, and Max won't let harm near you." The German shepherd, now almost constantly at Emma's heels, lifted his head at the sound of his name, ears sharp, eyes fierce. He pressed his body against her leg as if to assure her of his role. Jack touched the brim of his hat and rode away, dust rising behind him as thunderclouds once more gathered on the horizon. For 2 days the ranch seemed quiet, though the silence felt brittle, stretched tight as wire. Emma tried to occupy herself, mending torn curtains, helping Daniel with feed, walking the rows of young wheat, but her nerves frayed with every shifting shadow. Max never left her side, his body tense, his ears swiveling at every distant noise. Daniel, rifle slung across his shoulder, kept watch from the porch, his boyish face hardened by responsibility that weighed more heavily than his years. On the third afternoon, the danger arrived. A column of riders appeared at the far end of the valley, dust rising behind them like a storm. 6 men, rough and weather-beaten, their eyes sharp with the hunger of bounty hunters. Leading them was Caleb Dorsey, a man notorious in 3 states. Caleb was tall and lean, his frame wiry as a whip, his face gaunt beneath a scruffy beard peppered with gray. His left eye was clouded from an old knife fight, leaving a pale scar that cut across his brow and cheek. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low and carried a shotgun cradled with casual menace. Caleb had once been a Union scout in the war, but too much blood and betrayal had twisted him into a man who hunted not for country or cause, but coin. The others were no better. Bruisers, drifters, men with hollow cheeks and twitching hands. One, called Red Tully, had hair the color of rust and a jagged scar down his lip. Another, Hank Murdoch, was heavy-set, with broken knuckles that told of too many bar fights. They were not men bound by honor, only by greed. Daniel spotted them first, his pulse hammering as he cocked his rifle. He shouted for Emma to get inside. She rushed to the cabin, heart pounding, Max growling like thunder at her side. She bolted the door, her hands trembling, then reached up to take down the old shotgun Jack kept mounted on the wall. The wood was worn smooth by years, the metal cold and heavy in her hands. The bounty hunters reined up before the porch. Caleb's single good eye swept the ranch with cold calculation. "Evening," he called, his voice rough. "We're looking for a girl. Goes by Emma Brooks. Montgomery's offering a fair reward for her safe return. Be neighborly, hand her over, and nobody gets hurt." Daniel stood in the doorway, rifle steady against his shoulder. "Ain't no one here by that name," he said, his young voice cracking but firm. Caleb chuckled, the sound humorless. "Son, I've been riding trails longer than you've been breathing. Don't lie to me." He gestured, and 2 of his men began to circle toward the back of the cabin. Inside, Emma pressed her back to the wall, breath ragged. Max's growl deepened, his eyes locked on the windows. She whispered, "Stay with me," and the dog nudged her hand with his nose before stalking toward the rear door. She followed, shotgun clenched tightly, her body trembling, but her will hardening. If they came through, she would not be taken without a fight. The ranch held its breath as the men closed in. Daniel fired a warning shot, the crack echoing across the valley. "Next one won't miss," he shouted. But the bounty hunters only laughed, hungry for the prize. Caleb raised his shotgun, ready to end the standoff. And then another shot rang out, from the ridge above. A bullet split the dirt at Caleb's feet. All heads turned as a figure appeared against the dying sun. Jack Collins, his silhouette etched in fire and shadow. He sat astride his mare, rifle in hand, the barrel still smoking. His voice cut through the valley like steel. "Step away from my ranch." Emma's knees nearly buckled with relief. Jack guided his horse down the slope, Max bursting from the cabin to meet him with a joyous bark. The bounty hunters shifted uneasily, for the man before them carried more than authority. He carried papers. Jack dismounted, pulled a folded document from inside his coat, and raised it high. "By order of the Territorial Court in Denver," he declared, "Emma Brooks is my lawful wife. Any man attempting to take her is breaking the law, and I'll treat him as such." For a moment, the world hung suspended. Caleb's good eye narrowed, but even he knew when odds had turned. A lawful marriage certificate stripped Montgomery's claim bare, and killing a man like Jack with proof in hand would turn the law squarely against them. Caleb spat into the dirt. "5,000 ain't worth a noose," he muttered. With a sharp whistle, he turned his horse, his men following reluctantly. The thunder of their departure faded into the hills, leaving only silence behind. Emma stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun still clutched in her hands, her face pale but resolute. Jack strode to her, his arm sliding around her shoulders. She sagged into him, her breath hitching as the weight of fear finally broke. Max circled them, tail wagging furiously, barking once as if to announce victory. Daniel lowered his rifle, relief flooding his boyish face. As the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the valley in gold, Emma looked up at Jack, her eyes shimmering with gratitude and something deeper she dared not yet name. She whispered, "You came back." Jack's hand tightened gently on her arm. "Always," he said. And in that moment, beneath the shadow of danger and the glow of survival, they stood together. Not just fugitives from Montgomery's wrath, but husband and wife, defended by love, loyalty, and the fierce bark of a shepherd dog. Chapter 5. Freedom, Family, and Dawn. After the storm. The night after the siege settled into an uneasy stillness. The valley lay cloaked in silence, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional whicker of horses in the corral. Inside the Collins cabin, the fire glowed low in the hearth, casting golden light across rough-hewn walls and worn furniture. Emma sat at the edge of the sofa, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart still unsteady after the confrontation. Jack was near the window, staring out into the darkness as if waiting for danger to return. Max lay stretched across the floor between them, his large German shepherd frame tense, ears twitching at every stray sound. His thick black and tan coat gleamed in the firelight, and his steady breathing was the only rhythm that calmed the room. At last Emma broke the silence, her voice soft but trembling with a truth she could no longer contain. "Jack," she whispered, "I thought I would die today. And in that moment, I realized something. I'm not afraid anymore, not as long as I am with you. I love you." Her words hung in the air, fragile but unshakable. Jack turned from the window, his blue eyes softened by firelight. He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling before her, his strong hands covering hers. His face, weathered by years of hardship, carried lines of grief, but also the resilience of a man who had fought too many battles. "Emma," he said, his voice low, roughened with emotion, "I never thought I'd have a place for love again, but you filled the emptiness I carried for too long. I love you too." She leaned into him, and his arms wrapped around her, pulling her close against his chest. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt wholly safe. Max wagged his tail and lifted his head, giving a low, contented whine before laying it back down on his paws. To the dog, the embrace seemed to affirm what he had sensed all along. His master and the woman he had chosen to protect belonged together. That night, Emma and Jack sat close by the hearth until sleep overcame them both, Max ever watchful by their side. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying away the echoes of gunfire, leaving only the promise of morning. Epilogue. 1 year later. Spring sunlight poured across the valley, warm and golden, painting the Collins Ranch in colors of abundance. The cabin had grown. A new wing stretched from the original structure, its windows glinting in the light. The barn, rebuilt stronger after the siege, now housed not only horses but new wagons and a small granary. Wheat fields rippled in the breeze, and cattle grazed contentedly on the western slopes. On this day, neighbors from Silver Creek and beyond gathered beneath the cottonwoods. Tables groaned with food, roast venison, cornbread, pies of every kind. Children darted between adults, shrieking with laughter, while fiddles played merry tunes. It was the first anniversary of Jack and Emma's marriage, and the community had come to celebrate not only the couple, but the life they had carved out from hardship. Emma stood on the porch, her hair now longer, braided with wildflowers by neighborly hands. Her face, once pale from fear, now glowed with the quiet strength of a woman who had chosen her own path. At her side stood Jack, taller than most, his broad shoulders straight, his beard trimmed neatly, his eyes carrying the calm pride of a man who had found both purpose and peace. Daniel Cooper, no longer the uncertain ranch hand of a year ago, moved easily among the crowd. At 21, his wiry frame had filled with muscle, and his sandy hair caught the sun as he carried trays of cider for guests. His confidence had grown as much as the ranch itself, and though still shy around strangers, his smile came more readily now. He had become more than a hand. He was family. Near the corral, a small girl with dark curls ran with unrestrained joy, her laughter pealing like a bell. This was Clara, the 4-year-old orphan from Silver Creek, whom Emma and Jack had taken in 6 months earlier when fever swept through the town. She wore a simple cotton dress, her small boots scuffing the earth as she chased after Max. The German shepherd, older but still brimming with vitality, barked happily, circling the child protectively, as though he understood her place in their family. Clara squealed with delight each time he bounded near, throwing her arms around his thick neck in trust that was never misplaced. Emma rested a hand over her stomach, the faint curve beneath her dress revealing a secret that was quickly becoming known. Their first child was expected by winter. Jack's arm wrapped around her shoulders, his touch protective, tender. "Looks like Clara will have a brother or sister soon enough," he said quietly, his lips brushing her temple. Emma leaned into him, her heart swelling at the thought of the life they had built. As the afternoon wore on, laughter and music filled the ranch. Margaret and Thomas Walker, their oldest neighbors, told stories beneath the shade of the trees, while Sheriff James Taylor, silver hair glinting, raised a toast to peace in the valley. Even the bitter memory of Montgomery seemed to fade. His power diminished after his hired men abandoned him and his debts mounted. The law had finally caught up with him, and word of his ruin had become just another tale told over whiskey. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the barn, Emma slipped away from the noise for a moment. She walked into the dim coolness of the stable, where horses shifted gently in their stalls. Her eyes fell upon a whip hanging on the wall, the very same one once raised to break her spirit. It now hung unused, a relic of cruelty, kept not as a weapon but as a reminder. She reached out, fingertips brushing the worn leather, and whispered softly, "From one lash to a home." Behind her, footsteps approached. Jack entered, Clara perched on his arm, Max padding faithfully at his heels. He pressed a kiss to Emma's forehead, his voice steady with love. "We've come a long way." She smiled through tears, nodding, "And we've still so far to go." Together they stepped out of the barn into the golden dusk. The valley spread before them, alive with music, laughter, and the promise of the future. Family, freedom, and love. Hard won, but theirs forever. From one cruel lash meant to break a woman came the blessing of a family, a home, and a love that no one could take away. Some call it chance, but we know better. This was a miracle only God Himself could weave. A reminder that even in the darkest storms, His hand can turn pain into purpose and despair into new beginnings. And maybe that's the truth for all of us. In our everyday lives, we carry scars, words meant to wound us, burdens we never asked for, losses we thought would crush us. Yet God can take even those broken pieces and build something beautiful. Just as Emma found freedom and Jack found love, we too can find hope when we place our trust not in fear, but in His grace. If this story touched your heart, I invite you, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what miracles you're praying for. And if you believe in courage, loyalty, and the power of God's love, make sure to subscribe and join us for more stories like this. May the Lord bless you, guard your steps, and remind you that no whip of this world can silence the hope He plants in your heart.